Okay, magandang araw po sa inyong lahat. Welcome again sa ating channel, Sir Lopez Vlog. Sa araw na ito ay magkakaroon tayo ng self-evaluation dito naman sa subject na obligations and contracts. Subject ito ng mga estudyante na naka-enroll sa kursong BSBA. So, 25 katanungan. 25 katanungan ang susukat sa ating academic preparations pagdating sa subject na ito. Ang mga kasagutan ay makikita lamang sa ating description box. Okay, so let's start. Question number 1. An obligation is a juridical necessity to give, to do, or not to do. This connotes that in case of non-compliance, there will be legal sanctions. Letter A, juridical necessity. Letter B, judicial functions. Letter C, contracts. Or letter D, obligations. Number 2. An obligation, if not fulfilled when it becomes due and demandable, may be enforced in court through action. Letter A, natural obligation. Letter B, civil obligation. Letter C, moral obligation. Or letter D, personal obligation. Number 3. Which of the following is an element of obligation that is referring to a person who is demanding the performance of the obligation? Letter A, active subject. Letter B, passive subject. Letter C, prestation. Or letter D, efficient cause. Number 4. Meeting of minds between the two persons. I repeat, meeting of minds between two persons whereby one binds himself with respect to the other to give, to do something, or to render some service, governed primarily by the agreement of the contracting parties. Letter A, agreement. Letter B, contract. Letter C, obligations. Or letter D, commitment. Number 5. Ordinary care, which an average and reasonably prudent man would do. Letter A, extraordinary diligence. Letter B, diligence of a good father. Letter C, diligence of a good mother. Or letter D, extraordinary care. Next, number 6. The blank has a right to the fruits of the thing from the time the obligation to deliver it arises. However, he shall acquire no real right over it until the same has been delivered to him. Letter A, creditor. Letter B, debtor. Letter C, obligee. Or letter D, obligor. Number 7. A right enforceable against the whole world. A, personal right. Letter B, ownership right. Letter C, possessional right. Or letter D, real right. Next, number 8. Blank is transferred by delivery, which could be either actual or constructive. Letter A, fruits. Letter B, ownership. Letter C, possession. Or letter D, right. Number 9. Something which is susceptible of particular designation or specification. Letter A, determinate thing. Letter B, indeterminate thing. Letter C, divisible thing. Or letter D, indivisible thing. Number 10. Remedies for failure of delivery, referring to determinate thing, except letter A, complaint for specific performance. Letter B, complaint for rescission of the obligation. Letter C, complaint for damages. Or letter D, he may ask others to perform at the expense of the debtor. 11. An blank thing cannot be object of destruction by a fortuitous event because genus never perishes. Letter A, indeterminate. Letter B, determinate. Number 12, an occurrence or happening which could not be foreseen or even if foreseen is inevitable, absolutely independent of the human intervention, or referring to act of God. Letter A, fortuitous event. Letter B, force majeure. 13. A contract necessarily gives rise to an obligation, but an obligation does not always need to have a contract. Letter A, true. Letter B, false. Letter C, may be true. Or letter D, may be false. 14. Which of the following is one of the requisites of prestation or object? Letter A, licit. Letter B, possible. Letter C, determinate or indeterminate. Correction. Letter C, determinate or indeterminate. Letter D, all of them. So I'm sorry for letter C. The spelling of the other one is indeterminate. 15. Arise from lawful, voluntary, and unilateral acts in which are enforceable to end that no one shall be unjustly enriched or benefited at the expense of another. Letter A, law. Letter B, contract. Letter C, quasi-contracts. Or letter D, delicts. 16. Every person obliged to give something is also obliged to blank of it with the proper diligence of a good father of a family, unless the law or the stipulation of the parties requires another standard of care. Letter A, special treatment. Letter B, respect. Letter C, take care. Or letter D, all of them. 17. When the creditor has a right to the fruits of the thing. A, from the perfection of the contract. Letter B, upon delivery of the principal. Letter C, upon payment of the principal. Or letter D, from the time the obligation to deliver it arises. 18. A right enforceable only against a definite person or group of persons. A, personal right. Letter B, ownership right. Letter C, possessional right. Or letter D, real right. 19. Ownership is transferred by blank, which could be either actual or constructive. Letter A, delivery. Letter B, agreement. Letter C, contract. Or letter D, payment of the price. 20. As a general rule, no person shall be responsible for those events which could not be foreseen, or which, though foreseen, are inevitable, except A, in cases expressly specified by the law. Letter B, when it is stipulated by the parties. Letter C, when the nature of the obligation requires assumption of risk. Or letter D, all of them. 21. When the obligation consists in not doing, and the obligor does what has been forbidden him, it shall also be undone, but not at his expense. A, true. B, false. C, may be true. Or letter D, may be false. 22. Delay on the part of the debtor to fulfill his obligation. A. Mora solvendi. B. Aquiliana. Letter C. Mora accipiendi. Or letter D. All of them. 23. Obligation whose performance does not depend upon a future or uncertain event. A. Pure obligation. B. Conditional obligations. Letter C. Mixed obligations. Or letter D. Obligation with penal clause. 24. Obligation to deliver is converted into an obligation to pay indemnity when, letter A, there is loss of the thing, letter B, impossibility of performance, letter C, both of them, or letter D, neither of them. Last number, 25. Refers to the susceptibility of an obligation to be performed partially. A. Installment. B. Divisibility. Letter C. Partiality. Or letter D. Indivisibility. Okay, so natapos na natin ang ating self-evaluation sa subject na ito. Mangyari lamang na sagutan na ang mga sumusunod at ilagay ninyo ang inyong mga sagutan sa link na makikita sa ating description box. Okay? So hanggang sa muli, maraming salamat at magandang araw po sa inyong lahat.